Well, the world's a pretty complicated place these days, I mean, there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
And trying to make sense of it all, especially the big international stuff, well, that can be really tricky.
Oh, absolutely.
But that's exactly why we're here today, for a deep dive.
Yeah.
Into one of those big situations. And today that's the situation in Ukraine.
Right.
We've got President Trump's administration deeply involved. There have been these diplomatic efforts going on recently. And I think for us, the mission today is really to unpack what's been happening and kind of look ahead, think about potential ways forward. What could happen? Where could this go?
Yeah, definitely. And when we look at this, one of the main goals that's been stated, particularly by President Trump's national security advisor, is that they really want to find a lasting resolution.
Okay, a lasting one.
Yeah, not just, a Band-Aid or a temporary fix. They're really aiming for something that's going to last.
I see. And is that just coming from our side? Or do we know if the people in Ukraine, if they also want that, a long-term, a future without this constant conflict?
Well, from what we're hearing, it seems that desire for a lasting resolution, a future free from conflict, is something that's shared, at least by some, within Ukraine as well, which, if that's true, that shared goal could be a really important foundation for any kind of progress.
Absolutely. I mean, if both sides want the same thing, in the long run, it's got to be easier to get there, right?
Exactly. And speaking of progress, there have been these ongoing diplomatic interactions happening with Russia.
Oh, right. Everyone's been talking about that.
Yeah. And from what's been reported, it seems like these diplomatic efforts are at a pretty delicate stage, but also a very crucial one. We're hearing that President Putin has reportedly expressed a willingness to consider a stop to the fighting.
Wow, that's a big deal, isn't it?
It is. It's a significant statement. However, it's important to remember that this potential stop to the fighting it's not unconditional.
So there's some strings attached.
Right. President Putin has apparently outlined certain considerations, certain conditions that would need to be met. And these are things that the U.S. National Security Team is currently evaluating.
So they're really going through these points, trying to figure out what they mean, what the implications are.
Exactly. And it really highlights how this isn't a simple, black and white situation. It's a complex process.
Definitely. Sort of a back and forth dance, right? Each side trying to understand what the other's saying, what they really want.
Absolutely. And, this whole approach, this emphasis on a lasting resolution and the careful diplomatic maneuvering, it seems to be influenced by a particular view of how past international issues have been handled.
Oh, interesting. So they're looking back and saying, maybe we didn't do things the best way before.
Well, there's definitely a perspective out there that previous responses to international issues, they weren't always as effective as they could have been. They didn't necessarily achieve those long-term results.
So are they saying that we were too focused on the short term, just trying to put out fires instead of addressing the underlying problems?
Yeah, there's a sense of that. And there's a real contrast being drawn between those past strategies and how the current administration is approaching this. They're saying, look, we're determined to bring this conflict to an end, a real end, not just manage it indefinitely.
That's a big difference, isn't it? I mean, one is about finding a resolution, and the other is almost about accepting that the conflict is just going to keep going.
Exactly. And that's a significant shift in thinking, I think. It's moving away from what some people see as these prolonged involvements, these situations where we're engaged, but without a clear exit strategy, without a defined end goal.
So if a lasting resolution is really what they're aiming for, and diplomacy is the path they've chosen, I mean, what would that actually look like? What might some of the components of such a resolution be?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? And it's something that's been discussed, debated, for a while now.
Yeah, even before this current situation got really heated, I remember hearing about different proposals, different ideas.
Right, exactly. And so when we look at, what's been part of those conversations, what's likely being considered now as a potential framework, a way to bring both sides to the table, there are a few key areas that keep coming up.
Like what? What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, one of the big ones is territorial considerations.
Okay, so that means who controls what land?
Right.
What the borders look like.
Exactly. And it's pretty clear that those discussions about land control and borders, they're almost certainly part of the equation here.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really talk about a resolution without addressing that, right?
Absolutely. And, your sources probably go into more detail about specific regions like Crimea and the Donbass, because those have been really central to these territorial discussions.
Right. Those are the areas that have been, uh, contested, let's say.
Exactly. And what's interesting is to think about, what control actually means in this context, or what security guarantees might look like for these areas according to the different parties involved.
That's a good point. I mean, are we talking about formal annexation, or maybe some kind of special autonomous status, or even demilitarized zones? There are a lot of possibilities.
A lot of possibilities, yeah. And then another major aspect that seems to be front and center is the future status of Ukraine itself.
Okay, so like what happens to Ukraine as a country?
Exactly. And a big part of that discussion revolves around potential NATO membership.
Ah, right. That's been a really sensitive topic.
It has. And from what we're hearing, it seems that a permanent pathway to NATO membership, or even full membership for Ukraine, is viewed as highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely by everyone, or just by us.
Well, that's an important point to make. It's not just the U.S. that's hesitant about that. It's a viewpoint that's reportedly shared by several countries.
So it's not just us saying, no, Ukraine can't join. It's more like a broader international consensus.
Exactly. And that adds a whole other layer of complexity, to any potential security arrangements that might be part of a resolution.
Yeah, because if NATO's not really an option, then what is? What other kind of security frameworks might be acceptable to everyone involved?
That's the question. And then, we also have to address the very sensitive topic of potential territorial adjustments.
Ah, right. That's the part where things can get really complicated.
It is. And we're specifically talking about adjustments in regions that have significant populations from Russia.
Right. So not just land, but also taking into account the people who live there.
Exactly. And the Donbass region, that's often mentioned as an example of where these kinds of adjustments might be part of the discussions.
I see. So are we talking about like redrawing borders based on where certain populations are concentrated?
Well, it's not necessarily that simple. But the idea of territorial adjustments in areas with large populations that have ties to Russia, it's something that's come up before.
So it's not a new idea.
No, and it's likely being revisited now as part of this effort to find a negotiated settlement, a solution that both sides, even if they don't love it, might be willing to accept.
So it's about finding something that's, maybe not perfect, but workable.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how these potential adjustments, they intersect with those discussions about security guarantees that we were talking about earlier.
Right, because if you're going to change borders, you have to figure out how to ensure security for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And with all of these complex issues on the table, it really begs the question.
Right.
Is the strategy that the administration's pursuing, is it actually in our best interest?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, it's all well and good to talk about resolutions and negotiations, but at the end of the day, it has to serve our interests.
It does, and that's really the core issue here. Does this diplomatic path, does it align with our broader national interest?
And I guess the other question is it realistic? I mean, given everything that's happening on the ground, can they actually achieve what they're setting out to do?
That's the other big question, yeah. And one of the specific points being raised is whether the goal here is a complete removal of all Russian presence from all of Ukraine.
Including Crimea.
Including Crimea. And that's a really high bar to set.
It is. I mean, that would be a huge victory, but is it achievable?
Well, that's what the U.S. National Security Team is trying to figure out. They're evaluating those conditions that President Putin has put forward.
So it's not just the president making the call.
Yeah.
He's got this whole team of advisors from defense, diplomacy, intelligence, all those areas.
Right. It's a whole team effort. And your sources might give you some more insights into which specific agencies or individuals are playing key roles in this evaluation process.
Oh, yeah. That would be interesting to see. Who's really driving the decision making here?
Absolutely. And it's important to note how this current approach, this focus on a negotiated settlement, it really contrasts with what some people describe as the previous administration's strategy.
Oh, so they're saying this is a different way of doing things.
Yeah, they're drawing a distinction. They're saying that the previous approach was more of an open-ended commitment.
So we were involved, but without a clear timeline or even a specific set of objectives.
Right. And that's the concern with that kind of open-ended approach. It can lead to a conflict that just drags on and on with continued losses and a higher risk of the situation escalating even further.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a worry.
And so you could argue that these current diplomatic efforts, they're at least partly an attempt to avoid that kind of outcome.
To find a way to end the conflict, not just manage it.
Exactly, to find a path forward that's more realistic, given the current situation on the ground.
So it's a really delicate balance, isn't it? Trying to find a solution that addresses our interests, but is also achievable.
Absolutely. And it's playing out on a global stage with huge implications for everyone involved.
Well, it sounds like this situation in Ukraine is about as complex as it gets.
Yeah.
We've got this push for a lasting resolution, diplomatic efforts underway, potential deals being discussed, and all of this against the backdrop of national interests and what's actually realistic to achieve. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is, and it really highlights the challenges of trying to create a lasting peace in such a complex geopolitical environment.
Definitely. And I think for all of us watching, it's worth thinking about what factors, what fundamental elements might ultimately determine whether a resolution, a real and lasting resolution, can actually be found. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.